Welcome and thanks for coming, and let's talk about alliums, which really are for every season. Alliums are a bulb, and bulbs are pretty amazing. I guess last year I did a workshop on roots, and there were several people who complained that I didn't cover onions. Well, that's because they're not roots. They're actually bulbs, and I had way more than I could fit in that workshop anyway, so I made that distinction. I mean, it's not, I don't want to tell somebody, oh, you're wrong, because it's enough like a root that I understand why you'd say that, But they actually are a modified underground stem that is surrounded by leaves that have evolved to store nutrients which support them. And so every garlic clove is actually a leaf. And it's actually storing the energy that way. And the leaves are directly, that's why you don't want to take the leaves off the plant while it's growing, and the more you lose leaves, the less garlic you're going to get. And then when it shoots up that stem, all that energy is going to that. That's why, and we'll get to that when you're growing the rocambole and the other stiff-necked garlics, you've got to pull those scapes off or you're going to have a 30% smaller bulb. I had this amazing amaryllis blooming last winter. It was like, I think 9 or 10 blossoms on one amaryllis, all huge. I wish I'd put that next because the family is Amarylliaceae, and they're closely related. Not so closely that you want to eat amaryllis bulbs, but the big ones. And if I was probably other places in the country like Los Angeles, I probably wouldn't have ramps in this category. But here in the mountains, ramps are actually pretty a considerable amount of them are consumed. These are the ones that, in my opinion, and in the order I'm guessing, the greatest amount of consumption happens. And some people might argue about leeks and scallions. The scallions maybe should be above the leeks for a lot of people. I don't know. I use more leeks. Onions are the most widely consumed vegetable in the world. Every culture uses them, with the exception of certain spiritual groups in India. There is and we know someone who's not around anymore, but she actually figured out through a spiritual path that she was way too fiery if she ate onions. She was way too argumentative, got way too volatile. She stopped eating onions, and she was a way more tempered personality. It seems like it's probably a spiritual path thing. I don't know that science ever wants to talk about that, but we don't need to talk to science about it anyways, right? But otherwise, aside from certain spiritual paths, onions are eaten by everybody. And for me, many a night I'll walk into the house and I'll start chopping the onion before I know what I'm cooking, because I know I'm going to have onion in whatever I cook. Garlic, there's a wonderful movie called Garlic is as Good as 10 Mothers. Indeed, it's both medicinal and food. And something that I learned a couple of years ago, and then in researching for this talk, is if you really want like maximum health impact from garlic, and actually shallots, and I think chives all have allicin in them. There's corticin and camphorol or something like that, 2 major antioxidants, real important ones that are in almost all the alliums, if not all of them, at varying levels. But garlic is way high in the allicin, and it turns out that it doesn't even form until you've chopped it. It takes the interaction with oxidation for the enzymes to start happening that make that into the nutrient. I probably don't have this perfect. Some nutritionists go ahead and tear me up, but that's the rough idea. Chop it and give it 10 minutes for maximum value. And from some stuff I read while I was researching it, don't let it go for more than 12 hours, because then it's going to go the other way and you won't get the value. And for me, I don't plan well enough, so lots of times it's more like 5 minutes or whatever because I'm hungry. But anytime you can give it means there's more of that. And then people probably know with garlic, it's important always to try and put it in towards the end, so you're not cooking away a lot of that good stuff. And of course, you put it in too soon and you won't even know you had it in there flavor-wise. It'll be really subtle. It gets tamed a lot by cooking. Leeks are not as commonly used, but they have their own distinct flavor. And really what I love leeks for is they make me focus on making wonderful soups. They're just like the basis of wonderful soups. But also baby leeks, grilled and stuff, are wonderful in dishes. As far as cooking, soups and grilling are my 2 favorite ways to go with them. Scallions are interesting because I put the Latin names on a lot of these things, but really scallions I could have put several Latin names, because we use all different kinds of alliums for scallions. Basically any young allium is a scallion for a lot of people. Like I've actually used garlic sprouts from the year before as scallions. And they're real nice. They're not as strong, and they work kind of the same way. There's, I think it's fistulatum or something like that. Anyways, I got it written down. That's the Latin name for the ones that are actually scallions. But the regular common everyday onion, Allium cepa, just grow them small, and they're scallions. You know, there's lots of different ones. My favorite scallions, and I was out in the porch there, is actually evergreen hardy bunching onion, which to me, even though it's in the family of scallions, I qualify as a bunching onion because the more commonly grown scallions around on a lot of farms anyway are things like white Lisbon, and then various other ones that Johnny's had, which I think I mentioned on the slide. They're definitely annuals. You put them in, you harvest them right away. What I love about the evergreen hardy bunching and the Welsh onions is you can keep harvesting them. You know, you just don't take them all and they keep coming back. You all have been to Highland Lake. Remember those big long rows of bunching onions? I wish I had the seed for those.
The walking onion?
Not the walking. There was a yellow and a red bunching of it, and they had rows and rows of them. And they were, for 10 months out of the year, they could be harvested. Like it was kind of a point of honor to actually put a lot of food from the garden on the plate, and that's one of the ways we did, because we sent 5-gallon buckets up every day, and we could just pick them, you know, just because by the time you got to one end, the other end had multiplied again already. We had like, I think, 4 beds of each, 60-foot beds. That's a lot of bunching onions. Chives to me are like one of the stalwarts of the garden. They're like one of the very last things to go down, right? I mean, they're usually around still in early December. Take some hard cold and knock them into the ground. What happens in February? Popping up again, you know? Which means 10 months. 10 months, you know, of production. Sometimes a little more than 10 months. Sometimes, you know, 10 and a half. And basically cut and come again. The more you cut them, the more they grow. And you can use the flowers. They do get a little inconvenient in the summer because they're wanting to flower a lot, and then you got to try and pull those like tough stems out. On the other hand, you know, they're doing all kinds of good work for the garden and the flowering, so they kind of rock. And then shallots, and I got to confess to you folks, me and shallots have not had the friendliest of relationships. I'm hoping to make the time to do a taste test. And I just, in reading, you know, more, and I always like doing deeper research when I'm doing these kind of classes, even though I've grown shallots lots of times, and frankly never had great results, and now I think I know why, which I'll get to later. I would then cook them and go like, what's the big deal? They're way too much trouble for the difference in taste. So I'm going more into reading about cooking them now, and they go, oh, you really shouldn't cook them, because the flavor is so mild that it disappears. Well, unfortunately, all the recipes that I looked at were for cooking them, you know, and so it's like, they're not worth the trouble to me. They're pretty, and it turns out the other reason, which I'll get to later, but I'll briefly mention it now, is they're actually more nutritious. They have a higher concentration of nutrients. So they got their reasons, and maybe today I'll learn why. I'm going to try actually putting them in eggs, but not cooking them. We're going to try not very much at all, 1 egg of each, you know, just a little taste. The onion will get cooked a little bit, but probably lightly, so we can still have a comparison. And the shallots will get tossed in as I'm scrambling the eggs. So maybe the flavor will show up, and maybe we can discern the difference. I'm not going to tell you which is which either. So then you can tell me. We'll see. And then ramps. You know, ramps. I love ramps, and I'm blessed that I live high enough up in the mountains that I inherited a patch when I moved in. And further blessed that when I came back from living at Highland Lake Inn, where I planted 3 Fraser firs that I was going to use for Christmas trees, but they never looked very good, so I kind of left them in. And they were probably at about 15 feet when I got back. And they're not growing very fast. They're in the understory, which they do fine in. Lo and behold, the ramp patch had jumped. It was probably 45, 50 feet. It might be more like 60 or 70 feet from the original ramp patch to there. And when we get to it, I'll pass around. I have some ramp seeds. You'll see they're not likely to wind blow. You know, a really big storm maybe, but it'd have to be a heck of a storm. So probably moved by rodents. And probably 1 or 2 came up when we went away, and took 5 years later, came back, and there was a patch of like 30 or 40, and now it's 50 or 70. And as ramps are, in my experience, they were under 2 trees, and this year they were only under 1. They were thicker under 1, but 1 whole tree's worth went away. Meanwhile, another little patch here and there. That's what ramps are like. You know, they're ephemeral in many ways. You know, they are a spring ephemeral. They grow well under deciduous trees, rich forest. And they need the leaves off. You know, they're not going to do well under conifers. And yet, where are they? They're underneath the Fraser firs. So what am I talking about? I don't know. You know, I actually suspect that has to do with mycorrhizae, though. I suspect that the right mycorrhizae were on those firs, and that was why they did well there. And we're just beginning to learn about mycorrhizae. And you know, when I talk about fertility, I'll revisit that, but it's pretty critical. Does everybody know what I mean when I say mycorrhizae? Anybody need an explanation? Okay. So it turns out, and now it's becoming more and more of a big deal to growers. We're really getting that our soils are actually very bacterial because of what we do, because we till them so much. And fungi, they thrive with the strands, the filaments, right? The mycorrhizal filaments. And when we till it up, we wipe it out. Well, it turns out that lots of plants, onions are one of those, right? If you look at onions, there's not a lot of fine root hairs on them, right? None of their roots are very big, but they're all like, bigger than a lot of plants. A lot of plants have lots of little fine root hairs. The plants like that, like squash, strawberries, or other ones, that don't have lots of fine root hairs, are usually highly mycorrhizal. They have major relationships with mycorrhizae, and they count on the mycorrhizae, as do the vast majority of the vegetables we eat, and the tree fruits we eat, rely on mycorrhizae for their extended network, which is their root system. That's how they access minerals. Mycorrhizae actually can exude acids and make minerals available that roots wouldn't be able to get otherwise. And they have way more access to water, which of course is critical for onions, and obviously was not a problem here in the mountains this year. Those are the big ones I think that we eat the most of around here. Anybody disagree with that? Is there anything I'm missing? Any onion that you use a lot that's not on that list? You probably use a lot of potato onions, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. And that's, for homesteaders, this could easily, the secondary onions might be your major onions, because they indeed are a lot easier to produce. What I love about onions in general, and actually I tried to figure out how to say it in the title, but it just was too awkward. They are infinitely reproducible. Lots of them reproduce from seed, from divisions, from bulbulos. They reproduce many ways. And when I talk about Egyptian walking onions, I got just, I don't know how many people know Yana Fishman, Doug Elliott's wife, but I just was visiting her, and we always just make each other not able to sleep at night with the different things that we tell each other that we didn't know. And she just came up with a new way to treat Egyptian walking onions that she learned from some old timer who grows tons of them. And it's pretty revolutionary, so I look forward to sharing that with you too. And by doing that, you could actually use your same garden to grow your vegetables in the summertime, and then have tons of walking onions by springtime where your vegetables were. And who's to say that walking onions couldn't be a cover crop? These are the other ones, the onions I learned about researching this. There's one that grows in the highlands of the West. I think it's called Aztop or something like that. It's a northwestern Indian tribe, goes out and picks sacks full of it. They only pick the greens. And it's actually being grown as a crop in Washington. And I think actually I made a reference, like a reference page at the end. I'm pretty sure I put the link to that on there. So it's pretty fascinating. And maybe we should play with it, but this is a lot right here. So we have bunching onions. I already spoke to them a little bit. I really love the bunching onions. Welsh onion is a bunching onion, the Japanese, evergreen hardy, and then various ones that somebody still has those Highland Lake ones. I want to find those again. They were pretty special genetics, but there's a lot of them. One of the things I love about them is they're an example of multiple reproduction methods, because basically you can just leave one in and you get a bunch back all the time. But they have a period. You can pick them about 10 months out of the year, kind of like chives. But there's about 6 weeks to 8 weeks where they're ground to seed, and there's not much there to pick. The thing is, those seeds, they scatter everywhere, and you got baby onions coming up everywhere. You can move them around, or you can just let them come up and get really thick where you have them. You can pick them a lot younger and have really thin ones, And then, I don't know about the Welsh onions, but the evergreen hardy onions are why I say alliums for all seasons, because you can go outside in the dead of winter and find those guys either buried in snow or just frozen solid. You could actually break them off frozen solid, and it's likely that you would just peel off this sheet of frozen slimy onion, have this pearly white, crisp, sweet as can be, long white stalk underneath. Maybe that, I've done it where the outside of the onion was frozen and the inside wasn't. Maybe you should wait for a thawed time, but if you're, want an onion real bad, you can go for them. I love potato onions, and I'm guilty in many things in my life of taking things for granted, and we shouldn't do that. Troy's Greenhouse is an institution up in Burnsville. Troy's Greenhouse is the kind of place where the locals came in and sold him stuff that he then sold to you. So he still had a distribution network that was off the road that we're going to need to have if we don't have a supply thing. The problem is the people who did that were the old timers. The kids aren't bothering to grow potato onions and take them in and trade them, you know. They're busy, like, you know, figuring out how to make money on Bitcoin or something, you know. And so I could buy them any year. And I would put them in, and I brought a bunch down here, we planted them, and they got weedy, and I was busy, and the guys just kind of mowed them down, and we lost them, and I went back to Wade's and said, I need more potato onions. He says, oh yeah, he died. Can't get them anymore, you know. So I just got some more right now. I'm gonna plant them. I love them. I really love their rhythm. You know, it's like plant the big ones, get a bunch of little ones, plant the little ones, get the big ones. You know, so you always, you know, the ones you want to eat, you know, are the big ones. So if you want to multiply, you plant the big ones too, get a bunch of little ones, and then you're multiplying. If you want to maintain it, you eat all the big ones, and you know, and there's some good looking ones in there. They have a flavor. They are actually in the same family as shallots and bulb onions. Maybe that's, I don't know how to pronounce Latin, folks. CEPA. But they are, you know, really highly easy to grow. Very tough and keep a long time, you know. And so for homesteaders, they're probably a real winner. And there's many different ones out there, and we really should be trying to trace them down and keep track and get them back into play, because as people get more into growing and stuff, they could be a winner. They could really be helpful to small-scale growers too. You know, it's something that comes in at a time that you're glad to have. You know, and you can hold them for a time where you don't have much, and then bring them to the market and sell them. And indeed, people will be buying them to eat, but also to grow. So they have a lot of potential. Walking onions, I haven't grown those in a long time. I thought they were too much trouble, but now Yana has given me a new method, and I'm on fire about them, so I'll share that. People know why they're called walking onions? Because they're top set, and they're heavy, and then they fall over, and if conditions are right, which they usually are here, you need rain, which we usually have, they root, and so they kind of walk around the garden. And then they're also called tree onions because they can top set and then top set from the top set, you know, which is pretty fun. We got some out there. I actually put pictures in of things that we didn't have, and also, I hadn't mentioned that yet, but of course, pride goeth before the fall. So when we scheduled this onion class, it was like, we can definitely teach onion growing, man. We ace those every year. And I can show you one picture, and then if I can figure out how to get them to come up, show you many more of like really spectacular onion crops. I mean, nice, big, fat onions, every one of them, or almost every one of them. This year, we had a little bit of rhizoctonia, so they were kind of off to a slow start. We took some losses. We'll look at the beds and see where they were. Then it was really dry when it was cold, and we don't like to run our irrigation when it's cold because we have to drain it each time. So we kind of just hope that we can squeak by, and you know, we ran a hose out there and watered once and twice, but we didn't really put the irrigation up. And we should have, of course, because you don't want to do that. Onions want to be growing. You know, it wasn't cold in the daytime, and it's when the days are getting long, and that's when the onion wants to grow. We should have been watering. Still could have come through it fine. We've done it before. We've had the same thing happen. Then we had the 2 weeks before this last one. No sun, endless water. Our onion crop is looking fairly pathetic. The irony is, I know how to fix it. Onions, there's a wonderful handbook called Knott's Handbook, and it's definitely not bedtime reading. It's like all charts, and lots of them are about how to use pesticides and stuff, but there's still loads of fascinating information for organic growers too. But in there, they're talking about response to nitrogen. Alliums have a better response. You get more value for your nitrogen with alliums than anything else. And when I first learned that, boy, I laid the nitrogen on stuff. I would get these big garlics. I would get these huge onions. And the first time I did it in California, I fed nitrogen all winter. I had red onions so big that we had a gardening club, and I had to go to work, and I had to come late for the potluck. And when I got to walking down the street to my house, they came out on the deck and clapped. And it was because of those onions. I mean, they planned it, you know, as a joke. But the onions were huge, right? Problem is, I harvested them all, left them out to cure. And the sun is not very strong. And if you know the Bay Area, it's pretty foggy and all. They all got sun scald. Why? Way too much nitrogen. You know, not enough minerals. And we could do that right now. And we could even do it to a degree where we wouldn't have those kind of problems. They'd keep pretty well. The thing is, the longer I'm teaching and the more I learn from people like Dan Kitteridge, you know, I'm getting, and now have people heard about the nutrient collapse because of heightened carbon dioxide? We'll cover that towards the end if we have time. But basically, people go, oh, great, there's more carbon dioxide, plants will grow better. Well, guess what? Plants want to grow in balance. They don't want to have too much carbon because they're going to have too much sugars and not enough minerals. And if we went out and put nitrogen there, we'd be pushing it that way. So we'd be growing big vegetables that wouldn't keep as well and would be more water and less nutrients. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to accept our crop, whatever it is. Also, because of all that weather, the nutsedge, which is the bane of our garden here, and which really took over in 2013 the horrible endless rain it was, wasn't it? Yeah. We couldn't get in the garden then. We actually got deer predation and groundhog predation for the first time in that garden, because we're in that garden too much, for the deer and the groundhogs to feel comfortable. But it was so rainy that year that both of them moved in. We had to put a deer fence up, we had to catch a groundhog. This year, for those 2 weeks, same thing. Give you 2 weeks of not staying on top of that nutsedge, and the onions were buried in it. I came back from a trip and spent every spare minute I had weeding nutsedge out there. And I wasn't the only one. And of course, you have to do that because onions do not want weeds. They cannot compete well with weeds. So now that we've done that, they might come back. We might do fine. Anybody grow elephant garlic? Aha. And you like it?
It's mild.
To me, that's putting it mildly. I might use a different adjective. Now, I just read someplace that you should use it raw. Do you ever use it raw?
Some, not much.
And is it nice raw?
It's mild.
So you don't even notice it when it's raw? It sure is easy to grow. I bought, years ago, I was at an event, and there was this people next to me who I kind of knew, and their son was just at the age where he was in Future Farmers of America, and his crop was elephant garlic, and he was trying to sell it. Nobody bought it. At the end of the day, I bought a pound. It was like, kids didn't sell any. I'll try it, what the heck, Put it in, can't get rid of it. I mean, it just grows itself, it's there all the time. A couple times I said, well, I harvested it. Wow, there's a ton of it here. It's like, why did I cook this? I just can't notice it at all.
I was hoping you'd tell us how to get rid of it.
Some other crop. Yeah, no, it is pretty persistent. Yeah, it's true. You have to develop a market for it, right? I mean, it's the Tom Sawyer trick, right? You got to have people want it, Anyways, it's actually a leek. It does have that value. It has nutrients. So once again, if we were wanting food, I'd shut up about it real quick. I'd be real grateful for it if I was lacking for calories. So it does have that advantage, but it is not my favorite. And Welsh onions are one of the bunching onions, actually. I put it in a separate category because I found out a fascinating thing. Welsh onions, they're from Wales, right? Nope, northern China. Why are they called Welsh onions? In German, Welche or something like that, W-E-L-E-C-H-E, means foreign. So the Germans called them foreign onions, and that's how they got turned into Welsh onions. They're bunching onions. I just love that. It's fun to have that history. And then perennial leeks. That's a new one for me, and I'm real excited about it. From what I've read, it's going to, if I let what we have now go to seed, I'll be able to multiply it that way. And then once it's gone to seed, where I had one, there'll be a little clump. And if I let that grow for a year or two, I'll be able to sustainably harvest year-round. Leeks that vary in size from pencil to large finger size. And that sounds great. I love that kind of perennial food. I'm hoping it'll kind of be like the chives. Did anybody think I missed one of the more esoteric onions? Did I miss anything? Like I said, we could go into it. There's like tons of other ones. And indeed, I didn't put it in there, but I did get a link for it, and that's the ubiquitous wild garlic, right? Does anybody eat that? Me either. Okay. Some wild food people do, and I always feel like, oh yeah, I need to talk about that. But frankly, I'm not a fan of it, And it's a pretty nasty weed.
When you mentioned chives, there's the flat.
Garlic chives, and I forgot to put those in. I told myself I was going to. Thank you. Yes, right. Okay, so we'll talk about those when we go through chives. Remind me if I don't mention that, because I got lots to say about them, and I just like.
How are they different from the round ones?
Well, they have a garlic flavor for one thing. They're flat, right? Yeah, and they also, have. To me, they're what's most interesting about them is their penchant for flowering pretty heavily and doing it late. So to me, they're a beneficial insect plant in a big way. They also can be pretty darn near invasive. The only place I have them growing right now is in the shade back by the ramps. I have no idea how they got there. but they spread themselves pretty prolifically. And they have a use that I have not done yet, and when we get to them, I'm going to see if anybody has. But there's a culinary use in China that I think is pretty fascinating, and I've yet to do it. And indeed, we got some started, but they're not even in the ground yet, so we'll see. We let them go. And then there's also society garlic chives, which are pretty, but I'm not impressed with the flavor very much. Those are all nice, big onions. They're all like this, and the whole row is like that. I didn't just pick the biggest ones. I pretty well remembered a bunch of the ones that we grow. There's a new one, I think it's Expression, that Jeremy said we were trying this year, that he tried last year, that I had missed, that gets really nice and big also. It's a storage onion. And we really focus on the storage onions because how many onions can you eat in 4 months, you know? But we also grow Bridger. I didn't put that in there. Bridger is a yellow onion, but it's a 90-day one, and if you put it in over winter, it's 160 or something, but still comes in way early. And that's why it's called Bridger. It's supposed to bridge between when your onions won't store anymore, which is what potato onions do, right? And then when the next crop comes in. And then the sweet varieties, I only mentioned 3 of them there, Walla Walla and Vidalia. And then the one that I grew in California, which I loved, and which I grew here and wasn't nearly as good. But in California with those long, cool, not super cold winters so it can grow all winter, California flat red was like noticeably sweet. I just loved it. I grew tons of them. I came here, it was hot. You know, there's a relationship between how much sulfur in the soil and how cold it is with how hot the onions get. Definitely with garlic, Ron England talks about in his book, you want hot garlic, cold weather. You know, you grow it in a milder climate, it's not going to be as hot. You know. I don't really care for garlic, but I do like my sweet onions, and they're not as easy to grow here in the mountains. But you can do it if you get it. I grew a crop of Walla Walla once that did very well, but I started them in September. You can actually start them towards the end of August. They could be a 240-day onion. You know, and you want to put row cover over them. They'll kill it. They'll kill it about, I think, 10 below, maybe 10 above. But row cover is all it takes. And this is like something I teach all the time in winter gardening classes. Anything that's got that much hardiness, if it can survive outside to 10 degrees, then by putting the row cover on, you're slowing down how quickly it freezes, and that's what gets it. It's not that it can't freeze. If it can go to 10 degrees, you know it's frozen solid. It's just how quickly it freezes. So simply using row cover means that something like Walla Walla or other onions that you want to grow all through the winter are going to do better that way. The problem is, it was probably a pretty mild winter the year I did it because the colder it gets, the hotter they're going to get. You know, which kind of is counterintuitive to me because things like, you know, romaine lettuce, brassicas and all that, they're sweet as can be in the wintertime from the cold. And maybe these, I wouldn't be surprised actually if these weren't sweet in the dead of winter, but of course they're not big enough to eat then. And then later on, they get hotter.
The Vidalia onion, is it because of the soil?
The soil has a lot to do with it, but it's also genetics, and we can get those genetics. You know, you can't call it Vidalia, but it's just a Spanish Granax, you know. I mean, we can get those genetics, and if you ace it, you can get them to be sweet. But it's not, it's a tougher road for us to hoe. They have less sulfur in their soil, and that makes it easier, you know. And of course, they brag about it, it's there. But what's scary, I was actually doing a bunch of reading about this. It's always fascinating to read about this stuff. There's a part of Peru, that it's a high desert, and they brought irrigation to it, and so they have the perfect winters, and there's no phosphorus in the soil. And they actually put, in the early 2000s, a large Texas sweet onion business out of business. I mean, like, you know, tons of acres. They went to development because they can come in cheaper, and, you know. So now Peruvian sweet onions are coming in and competing with Vidalias. There's a few things to know about cooking with onions, right? And you probably all know that. You want them to be sweet when you cook them. You don't use the sweet onions. They actually have less sugars in them than the storage onions. The storage onions just have a lot of sulfur too. So if you cook the storage onions, you're cooking the sulfur off, right? It goes off as a gas, and then you get much sweeter onions. And so if you want to caramelize, you're going to get a lot more flavor cooking the storage onions than the sweet ones. Sweet ones are sweet raw, and they're pretty insipid cooked. And so you want to go with, and they also have more water in them, so you're going to get less, you know, less onion, and you're kind of wasting them. So just go with the storage onions for that. I know it's bad for me, but I love caramelized onions. And I highly recommend them as a cook. Not as a nutritionist. I'm going to be schizophrenic here, and skip the nutrition part, But for flavor, caramelizing onions is just, it gets you there all kinds of ways. And so I recommend that if you want to heighten flavor. As with the garlic, the finer you chop it, the more you're going to get that allicin. And I might be saying that right, it might lacin or whatever it is. But the more you're going to get that, really important antioxidant. So chopping it up ahead of time and letting it settle for a little bit is going to be good. People do know, right, that if the sulfur compound that's driving your eyes crazy, and it's got a fancy name like PYURVU something or another acid, drives you nuts when you chop onions, that there's a couple different things you can do. Refrigerating them helps a whole lot because it's a volatile, and if it's cold, it won't be as volatile. When I had a bakery, we would run, for onion rolls, we'd run 25 pounds of onions through a Hobart shredder, which does not do the most gentle job. And so people were just like bawling. It was like impossible. And what we do is set up a fan, blow that stuff out a window. So we set up a fan so it's just blowing it the other way. And then some people say to cut them underwater. It's like, good luck, I'd cut my fingers off. But, those are the various things you can do to avoid that, Red Wethersfield is a storage. There's also, of course, many other reds that are used for raw and fresh. It just depends on basically how dense they get as far as that goes. And as far as planting and production, we highly recommend not using the bulbs. How many people do onions from bulbs? Okay. And do you have many of them going to seed on you? No, okay. Do you get big bulbs or little bulbs? First time doing it, okay. Okay, so if you're going to use bulbs, at some places like Troy's, where they give a lot of service, he has two sizes. And to the surprise of some people, because you always think bigger is better, right? The bigger ones are cheaper. Which means the small ones are a much better deal, right? Because you're getting many more plants because they're smaller, but also they're way less likely to bolt. The bigger ones, the plant's further along, and now it's going back in the ground, and any disruption in its rhythm means it can go to bolt. That's why we don't grow them. Also, there's just not a very big selection of genetics if you're growing bulbs. So sets, I guess, is the proper word for it. We don't bother. What I like sets for most is I like to get the white ones and stick a bunch in, and it's fast green onions. And so that's the way I use sets, if I use them at all. And you don't have to use white ones. I like it because then even if they do skin up, you don't notice that they're not scallions. But aside from that, we like to buy our own seed, and I recommend starting them sometime in December if you got the time and the situation for doing it. They're bigger and nicer, and if you can get them out in a thaw and get them established and then put some row cover over them, they're going to be really gorgeous onions. But even if you can't, they'll just sit there and get bigger in the pot. And they don't really stunt out, in my experience. When they go out, they'll be great. So that's the main reason that we do sets, is the genetic selection. And you just don't have it. But an issue for some people you probably want it warm enough to get them to germinate. And when they're babies, they can be bothered by really harsh weather. Though they sure can take the cold. It wouldn't be like you couldn't put them outside most days. I bring them in during the coldest weather and the heavy snow so they didn't get crushed. But you could, grow them without even a greenhouse, and it would work. Though I might wait till February in that.
What temperature do they germinate?
They want to germinate in the 50s. They're going to do best in the 50s. And they'll germinate better and faster. When I say best, no, they'll probably germinate faster in the 70s, low 70s. But they'll germinate fine in the 50s. And why I say that means that you don't have to work that hard at it if you don't have an infrastructure set up for it. But if you do want to do it, we have a couple of videos about how to do seedlings and how to set yourself up to do them even if you don't have a greenhouse, or how to make a very inexpensive little greenhouse. So we prefer that way a whole lot. Then the other things they need, right? And I'm going to talk about fertility later on, but the other things they need is water, right? And protection from weeds. Those are the big ones. We'll get to the other problems they can run into and how to avoid them. We'll get to see an example. We do have some thrip damage down there now. We might spray They're just adding insults to the many injuries these onions have already had this year. We always have some thrip presence, by the way. And I'll talk about how to reduce that and deal with it when we get to the problem part. Okay, any questions about growing storage onions? Is there anything that you're wondering about that I haven't talked about?
Are those in that picture, are they already harvested?
No, they're in the ground. They're in the ground.
So they're not buried at all.
No, well, actually it's recommended to pull, we mulch them. We put enough mulch on that they're under the mulch as they're coming up. But then, and we don't have to do too much work because the mulch, of course, is rotting away as they grow, and so they end up on top. But they don't want to be in the ground a lot, especially in our climate here, especially like the last, couple weeks there, it gives them a hard time. And so people will say actually to come in and scrape the dirt away. We grow way too many onions to do that, But by putting tons of mulch on, we kind of slow down the nutsedge. It sure doesn't stop it, But it also gives the onions the cover that they need when they're young, but then it kind of goes away kind of perfectly for us. But yeah, I'd be impressed if I get all those onions to stand up like that. Me, they'd be falling over every time I try to take the picture, No, but they're not covered.